Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. Earth Day is this Saturday, and it marks the beginning of a big week of action on climate change. On April 22nd, scientists and their supporters are taking to the streets in over 500 locations across the U.S. and around the world in the first ever March for Science. And next Saturday, April 29th, another huge event, the People's Climate March. The Real News Network's Climate Change Bureau will be out in force for both flagship events in Washington, D.C. and in other locations internationally, so look out for that coverage right here on therealnews.com. Under the current administration and Republican-controlled Congress, there has been a veritable witch hunt against science and apparent justification for rollbacks on government regulations to protect the environment and public health that are science-based. Here's a clip of the congressman from Texas, Lamar Smith. He's chairman of the Congressional Science, Space, and Technology Committee as he headed up a hearing titled Climate Science, Assumptions, Policy Implications, and the Scientific Method, in which renowned climate scientist and friend to the Real News, Michael Mann, faced off against three prominent climate deniers, two of whom have been shown to have links to the fossil fuel industry. Let's take a look.
Much of climate science today appears to be based more on exaggerations, personal agendas, and questionable predictions than on the scientific method. Those who engage in such actions do a disservice to the American people and to their own profession. Only when scientists follow the scientific method can policymakers be confident that they are making the right decisions. Until then, the debate should continue.
With us to discuss why scientists, environmentalists, public health professionals, and doctors, among many others, are up in arms, we're joined with Janet Redman. She works with Oil Change USA. She's also the policy director at Oil Change International. Previously, Janet was the director of the Climate Policy Program at the Institute for Policy Studies and co-director of the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, where she provided analysis of the international financial institutions' energy investment and carbon finance activities. Her studies on the World Bank's climate activities include World Bank, Climate Profiteer, and Dirty is the New Clean, a critique of the World Bank's strategic framework for development and climate change. She's also a founding participant in the Global Climate Justice Now Network. She joins us today from Washington, D.C. Janet, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's discuss some of the latest assaults on the environment and public health perpetuated by President Trump. So talk to us about the president signing an executive order that included backing away from the Clean Power Plan regulations.
Right, that was now a couple of weeks ago, where we saw President Trump fulfilling one of his promises on the campaign trail, actually, to dismantle the Clean Power Plan, one of Obama's flagship pieces of his climate action plan, which was meant to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from power plants, particularly coal-fired power plants, and ramp up renewable energy in states. So this executive order it's called Energy Independence, but I think of it really as a kind of a climate disaster executive order. Both backed away from the Clean Power Plan, but did a number of other things as well. It also attacked executive orders from the Obama administration that were put in place to protect communities and build resilience to the climate impacts that are already built into our system at this point, and to help emergency workers, for example, deal with extreme weather impacts on communities in that space. It also took apart some really important pieces that probably many listeners don't know about. One is something called Council on Environmental Quality's guidance on greenhouse gas emissions in something called the National Environmental Protection Act. That was actually some guidance from the CEQ that said every federal activity, every federal project, pipelines, development, needed to assess their impacts on climate change, needed to look at their greenhouse gas emissions to really understand what a project's impact would be on climate change, but also how climate change would impact a project. Do you build a bridge for extreme flooding like we're seeing nowadays, or do you ignore that fact? Another piece that it took apart was something called the social cost of carbon, and that was another way for federal agencies to understand kind of the cost-benefit analysis of different activities, and that actually brought into consideration not just the immediate economic impact of a project, but what would this mean? What would a project mean in terms of the cost of the pollution, the health impacts, the broader climate impacts of any project? So that's going away as well.
So what does this mean, Janet, for the Paris Agreement, and what happens if the U.S. ends up pulling out?
It's a really tough question. I think many of us are debating what it looks like. I mean, it makes a lot of sense for the U.S. to stay in. Obviously, it's a binding agreement, a non-binding agreement, but binding in the sense that every country has agreed to do something on climate change in their own national context. 195 countries have signed it. It does lay out the goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees from industrial levels and aiming even more ambitiously to keeping temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. That's important. It's important that the U.S. is there. The Clean Power Plan was a piece of our, again, national plan to comply with the Paris Agreement. So if we pull out, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do the clean policy. And if we did take apart the Clean Power Plan, it doesn't mean that we can't stay in Paris, the Paris Agreement. But the real question here is whether or not it's better for the U.S. to be in the Paris Agreement or out of the Paris Agreement. And I think that's the discussion that was going to be held at the White House this week, with one camp, Steve Bannon, Scott Pruitt, saying, let's get out of the Paris Agreement. It sends a big signal. Trump promised to get us out of the Paris Agreement. And another camp, Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, saying, I think we should stay in and have a seat at the table. And that's actually also really concerning, because what he's been saying and what the Trump administration has been kind of hinting is, if we stay in the Paris Agreement, maybe we can use our power to leverage more goodies for fossil fuel technologies, calling them clean fossil fuel technologies like carbon capture and storage as part of capturing carbon dioxide outside of a coal-fired power plant. Maybe we can use our position at the table in the Paris Agreement to actually manipulate more giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. And I'm also very worried about that.
In his executive order, Donald Trump also reversed policy guiding agencies to consider the cost of climate change in his decisions. So what could this result in? What would be the outcome of this portion of this particular executive order?
I think we'll be seeing, one place we'll probably see this right away is in an infrastructure package, for example. So we know that's been a part of Trump's promises. We're going to expand the fossil fuel industry on public lands and public waters, more drilling, more mining, more offshore drilling, more fracking on our public lands, and use revenue from that, supposed revenue from that increased fossil fuel expansion to fund infrastructure. So on both sides of that puzzle, that will have real impact. Basically, what would the Trump administration open up for drilling, open up for fracking and mining? If we're not looking at the environmental and climate impact of those activities, then we're missing a big piece of the puzzle of reality. At the same time, if Trump is putting in place, or the Congress is putting in place, infrastructure that's expanding fossil fuel gas pipelines, oil pipelines, export terminals for fossil fuels, and not taking into consideration the climate impacts, we'll see a real digging into the fossil fuel industry that will be locked in for decades. And it's really that fossil fuel infrastructure lock-in that's a big concern. We may see the Trump administration leave after 4 years, obviously after 8 years, but once we've locked in some of that fossil fuel infrastructure, it's there for decades.
Indeed. Well, stick around, everybody. That was part one of our conversation with Jenna Redman. We have part two coming up right after this here on the Real News Network.